When we think about change or reinvention or transformation, I think the first things we think about are making changes on the outside, right? A lot of people say, oh, I got to change my career. I got to move to a different place. But as I've discovered on my journey, especially after I went through a really difficult burnout a few years ago, the only way to truly reinvent is from the inside. And so I'm really, really honored and excited to talk with my guest today because his work over the past, I was trying to think the first time that I encountered, probably more than a decade, has been a giant influence on me. Jerry Colonna is a coach, an author, and a speaker, and he focuses on leadership and business. But most importantly for this conversation, the practice of what he calls radical self-inquiry, which I think is very beautiful. He's the co-founder and CEO of Reboot.io. It's a company, I love this so much, I wrote it down so I would say it right, a company born from the rallying cry that work does not have to destroy us. Work can be the way in which we achieve our fullest self. I don't know if there's a more hopeful view of work that I've ever encountered. Jerry, thanks so much for being here. Welcome to Reinventability.
Oh, what a delight to be with you, and may everyone at some point in their life be introduced the way you just introduced me.
Well,
that would be a delight
I
for
really,
them.
it's everything I said is true. So, we were chatting before we started recording, and I shared with you that you started out in venture capital. I was in venture capital as one of my early career stops, which is so strange. I'd love to hear first how you went from what was your reinvention? What kind of was the inner driver for your reinvention from being an investor to being someone who helps leaders undertake this really meaningful and very difficult process of self-inquiry?
Well, let's get the branding right. It's a reboot, not a reinvention. Just kidding.
Good point.
uh,
Good point. Good point.
um, as I often say, that process, what you described as a reinvention, was actually more of a process of breaking down.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of there's a D.H. Lawrence quote. I won't bother with the whole poem, but he says, are you willing to be sponged out,
Mm.
wiped away, kind of annihilated so that you can be reborn?
Mm.
And it's a beautiful notion, but I think that the thing that is missing, and I suspect it's what happened for you as well, it's this reinvention process wasn't something we chose. It's something that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And the first telltale sign of that is a broken heart.
Mm-hmm.
And my heart started breaking in my mid-30s as a successful venture capitalist. And as we spoke before the recording, our paths directly did not intersect, but they intersected a little bit
Mm-hmm.
because we were both investing in New York at around the same time. And when the depression, which had plagued me most of my life, or been a companion for most of my life, had gotten so intense, as I often say, where the inside of me did not align with the outside of me,
Mm-hmm.
I had to either die or be reborn. I had to allow myself to be sponged out.
Mm.
And so everything that I am today, everything that you may have found comfort in through my work, stems from a decision to not be wiped out, but in fact to allow myself to be reborn.
Mm. As you're saying those words, Jerry, I'm thinking to the time in my life. It was about 9 years ago. I had started this company called Happier. We built this very popular gratitude sharing app. I was in the New York Times. We were helping hundreds of thousands of people. It was this really beautiful thing that I was really like filled with meaning. And I was feeling up until now, I described it as I felt this hollowness inside, right? And eventually it felt like the hollowness just took me in, right? Like none of my coping mechanisms that I had used previously, I just couldn't use them anymore. And I love how you talk about, even though it sounds very, I think, ominous, maybe to some people listening, and it would have sounded ominous to me, but what you describe as, like the inside wasn't aligned with the outside. I think that resonates so strongly for me. And I think it's, I'm often asked, I wonder your thoughts on this. Do you think we can or someone can really go through this process without having kind of a catalyst in a form of suffering?
I'd like to say yes, people can go through a transition and a transformation without suffering, but it would feel dishonest. And I think it's not, I don't mean to romanticize wounding or romanticize the hollowness. And by the way, that is the word I use as well, hollow and empty. It's not at all to romanticize that. Thousands of years ago, when the Buddha woke up to the Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth he hit upon was that life was filled with suffering. And the second noble truth is, in a sense, the denial of that suffering increases suffering. Fortunately, there's the third noble truth, which is that there is a way out. And the fourth noble truth, of course, is the Eightfold Path. But the most important recognition is that there is a certain part of suffering that goes along with life. And when you relax into the realization that growth can hurt, you start to see growth, or you start to see the suffering, the pain, not as an indication of you doing something wrong, but of you doing something right. But I think we can make it better. We can make the journey better. And I think the consciousness in which you invoke in your clients, similar to the work that I try to do, is designed to alleviate that suffering, to alleviate the worst of it.
Yeah. And there's a quote that I'm thinking about as you're talking. I'm sure you've come across it. One of the first books that I happened upon as I was kind of swallowed up by this darkness and really had no idea what to do. I mean, I was Googling things, how to feel better. I had no concept of this, But one of the first books I read was Polishing the Mirror by Ram Dass. I don't know who this guy was. The book was weird and it came in a silver cover, but it came up in a Google search and I had no idea. So I ordered it. And there's a quote in it where he says, "Suffering is the sandpaper to happiness." And I remember reading that. Of course, leave it to Ram Dass to sum up everything you and I have been saying in this like beautiful way. But I remember I read that, Jerry, and I was really angry at it. I was so angry at it. I closed that book. I was like, F this, like this spiritual BS, because I think it just spoke such truth with a capital T. Because I do, and I, like you, when people ask me this question, can you really have this transformation without suffering? I say, I don't think you can have it without pain. I think you can reduce the suffering, just like you said. But I do think we need a catalyst, because it's almost like, and Ram Dass, I think in that book, or maybe I heard a talk by him, he talked about how so many of us exist. We just have just enough suffering. We can just sort of cope with it. So it's just, we get through it, and then it has to increase to a place where we're ready to do something. Um, what is radical self-inquiry?
So that was a term I coined almost 20 years ago to try to describe what it was that I was seeking to do with my own work and with the work that I do with clients. And the way I define it is, it's a process by which the masks that we wear are slowly and compassionately stripped away so that there's no place left to hide, even from ourselves.
Mm.
I describe it as radical because, as you were pointing out, Ram Dass's assertion, we are socialized not, and this is mind-boggling, we are socialized to accept a certain amount of suffering and discomfort and delusion. And in fact, one of my famous words, complicity, in the question, how have I been complicit in creating the conditions I say I don't want? We are socialized to be complicit in a process of self-delusion. And what's important to note about the definition that I blithely threw out there, it's the adjective skillfully, or it's adverb skillfully and compassionately.
Mm.
Because when people start to undertake the process of going against the socialization and to do the radical work of saying, why do I do what I do? And how does what I do actually make my life more uncomfortable? And what is it that I would really like to have?
Mm.
When we start to do that work, we encounter our old friend guilt. Right? People will often hear me talk about how have I been complicit, and take it in as how have I been responsible.
Mm.
And complicity means helping. It means being an accomplice. It doesn't mean being responsible.
Mm.
See, I mean, what's really kind of mind-boggling is part of the way we do self-delusion is we deny what's going on. But another way we are self-delusional is we take responsibility for everything that's going
Yes.
on. Okay? And what's radical about radical self-inquiry is the use of that Buddhist notion of discernment.
Mm.
With sharp, what's called prajna, flaming sword wisdom, cutting through to say, what a knucklehead I'm being. I don't really need to be a knucklehead.
Mm.
I don't need to make my feelings worse. So that's a long-winded response to
No,
your
it's
question.
there's so much there. You know what, the part where the responsibility, that resonates with me a lot. You know, I come from a Russian Jewish family where, like, responsibility for how you are, it's all on the shoulders.
Y'all grew up feeling responsible for the entire state of the world. I'm
That's
kidding.
right. That's right. That's right. And so, you know, it's interesting. The one incident that comes to mind, I think you'll enjoy this. So long before this company, when I was actually leaving venture capital, I was a young mom. My daughter was a few years old, and I was in New York City. And I remember actually, she was younger. I think she was a year. I was still in VC. I went on, there was message boards, if anyone remembers what those are. It was a message board for moms. And I wrote, it was like 4 a.m. She wasn't sleeping. And I wrote something like, you know, I don't know why she won't sleep with us, but she sleeps with the nanny. And the first response I got back was, why don't you try to be a real mom and stay home?
Oh,
And
fuck me.
it wasn't
Excuse
very
my
kind,
language.
but because I'm an entrepreneur at heart, I said, okay, I need to build a community for working moms. So I left venture capital actually to start this company, Work at Mom, that became this wonderful community. And then it was 2008 and we needed to raise more money. And 2008 was the financial crisis and we couldn't. And so the company didn't make it. And I remember sitting there about a year later with my friend, Adam Freed. I don't know if you've ever.
I
Yeah.
do know Adam. Yes,
So
yes,
Adam was
yes.
still, we met. It was a long story. This was a while later. We met when I was part of a team that sold the company to PayPal. He was still at Etsy. We got connected, became really good friends. And I was sitting with him in his apartment in Brooklyn. And the Work at Mom failure was probably at that point 5 years ago. But I was carrying this responsibility. And I remember sitting there with him and saying, I can't believe I really failed. I couldn't make it work. We couldn't. And I just was the burden. And he said something so beautiful to me. He said, so let me get this straight. We had 2008 was the worst financial crisis since the 20s. Banks failed, like Lehman Brothers, the multi-billion-dollar bank failed. And you are sitting and telling me that the only reason your company failed is because you failed as a CEO. And to me, this kind of eliminates what you're saying is my way of not having any radical self-inquiry was to just take all the responsibility, put it here, suffer in it. And you know what? Feel good about that in a weird way. So it's kind of like feeling bad feels good, if that makes sense. Like, yeah, I'm responsible. And so I love that you focus so much, and I was just flipping through your book, which I've read twice, that you focus so much on self-compassion. Can you talk about the importance of self-compassion and what it means to you when we do this when we start to look at ourselves?
Sure. But before I do that, I want to give a shout out to our good friend, Adam Freed. God bless him for that. And Adam and his husband are fathers themselves now. And
Yes.
God bless them both.
Yeah.
So
I haven't talked to him in a while. What a good excuse to ping him.
exactly. Yeah. So I guess the thing that I would focus on is that sense of guilt that so dominates us. As you know from reading my book, I grew up in Brooklyn, a family, primarily Italian American family, Catholic. So I think we could sort of hold our own against y'all in the guilt category. And what's important about self-compassion is to actually reframe your relationship with that which you feel guilty about. It's more than giving you a day at the spa. It's more than self-care. And the best way I can express that is to quote my teacher, Sharon Salzberg, who, in her book, Loving Kindness, makes a really important distinction between guilt and remorse. And guilt, as she calls it, is self-lacerating. It actually keeps us stuck in the pain. Remorse is an empowering move. It's filled with discernment. And the best way to understand it is what is it that I can learn from my own behavior? And I don't know if you can feel it, but I certainly felt it when I just said that. Can you feel the self-compassion that's in there? We all will spin and ruminate on whatever misdeeds we've done in the past. But if we hold Sharon's point of view, that's self-lacerating. It keeps us stuck. It keeps us, quite honestly, out of the action, doing the very brave thing. For example, acknowledging and apologizing if we've hurt somebody, or taking an appropriate level of responsibility, not being a sponge and soaking up all the responsibility. That's what remorse does. And so I guess the best way to think about it is one of the most self-compassionate things one can do is to extract the remorse out of an experience so that we move forward.
I think that's such, and by the way, I was smiling. So Sharon's book, Loving Kindness, I think was the third book that came up from my Google searches of how to feel better. And again, it took me years to actually hear what she was saying. Because I feel like in my process, in my self discovery, there were these walls I had to keep putting down, and eventually I put enough of them to be able to hear. So I reread that book often. And I think this distinction, Jerry, between remorse and guilt, I'd forgotten she wrote about it. I think it's very powerful. You know, I work with a lot of people who are incredible humans. You know, I call them awesome humans. They're loving and caring, and they're great leaders, and they're caregiving to their family. And yet they
feel like
carry
crap.
this giant weight on them. It's
Right.
like this, it's not even a backpack. It's like this, you know, it's like this giant piece of marble that they're walking around with. And a lot of it is some form of guilt, right? I mean, the most common one, especially with, you know, women leaders I work with, oh, I constantly feel so guilty. I'm not a good enough mom. I'm not a good enough leader. And I remember like being in that constantly feeling guilty. I'm not with my daughter enough. I'm not with my team enough. And I think that it is a trap, right? You know, something you wrote that I actually underlined, and I think it connects to this, that I'd love you to just reflect on, that you said, learning to lead ourselves is hard because in the pursuit of love, safety, and belonging, we lose sight of our basic goodness and twist ourselves into what we think others want us to be. And what really struck me, and I remember this the first time I read it, is because I'd been, you know, doing a lot of this inner work to like learn to love myself, which I thought I was the only one who had to learn that. Now that I do this work, I've realized everyone has to learn that, which is also mind-boggling, why we have to learn that. But the sentence really struck me because I had this moment in my own journey where I had this experience, Jerry. I realized that I was working so hard to learn to love myself. I actually forgot that, like, I don't have to work so hard. Like, I am lovable, if that makes sense. So I'd love for you to talk about that, because I think that's a really important part of our rebirthing, if you would.
Or rebooting.
Or rebooting. Good branding, Jerry. Really, you're
Always on
whoever your
brand.
marketing people, you are on brand. You know, I always get this compliment that I'm always on brand. You are on brand, Jerry. I love it. Rebooting. Yes.
I'll say a few things about that, and build upon the observation. So to go back to that quote for a moment, this is one of the perversities of the way we get socialized. In our pursuit of love, safety, and belonging, which, as you know, is a central premise in the book Reboot, we often will do the very things that make us feel unloved, unsafe, and that we don't belong. And when we use radical self-inquiry to look at our complicity in that process, as we've been talking about, it doesn't behoove us to then self-lacerate and say, look at what an idiot I am. I am such a knucklehead. I cannot believe that in my pursuit for love, safety, and belonging, I make myself feel bad, or I reinforce the I'm not good enough. So that's, in the video game of life, that's level one. Let's go to level two. Okay. So in my new book, Reunion, which came out about a year ago, one of the things that I really tried to do was look at the question, to go beyond the work I did in Reboot, to look at the question of, through the lens of belonging generally, and look at the question of how we participate in a process in the world where there's this continuous lack of a sense of belonging. And while I touched upon it in Reboot, I really went deep on this in Reunion. And this is the point. So this process that you went through, Natalie, where you realized that what you were doing in your pursuit for love, safety, and belonging was making it difficult for you to feel loved, safe, or that you belong, you inherited that.
Mm.
You learned that at feet of the masters. And what do I mean by that? This is not one of these, to use a Buddhist term, self-arising thoughts. We learn a pattern of behavior from those who came before us.
Mm.
In Reunion, I talk about the ancestors. And you very quickly dropped a piece of information. You said, I was born in Russia, emigrated from Russia as a Jew, which means you were steeped in anti-Semitism with a history of pogroms.
Yes.
Right? And let's just pause and honor your ancestors.
Mm. My grandparents, who I was lucky enough to grow up with, my grandpa only died 4 years ago, and my grandma only 3 years before. So I'm very lucky I had them with me.
Think about their parents and grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
Think about their experiences. Think about how they were blamed for whatever economic challenges befell going back to the Russian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And one of the ways that they decided to keep the family safe was this kind of twisted, in order to feel safe, you must feel unsafe.
Mm. Mm.
When we, and this is why I talk about this in Reunion, by understanding and connecting with so many of the lessons that we were handed, they loved you to the moon and back. They wanted you nothing more for you than for you to feel love, safety, and belonging. So they kept you on your toes, worrying about whether or not you felt loved, safe, and belonging, whether or not you were enough. Because if you were enough, you might become complacent and therefore at risk. Does any of this resonate?
100%, Jerry, 100%. And this, I think it's probably only in the last few years, because as you know very well, this isn't a process where you begin and there's an end, right? This is an ongoing, but only in the last.
It's a practice.
It's a practice. That's right. Only in the last few years, I think I have had the courage to look at that and recognize that. Right. I remember I was just talking with someone about this, I remember I was going into first grade, and I think it was my dad. He said to me, okay, I knew how to read because my parents taught me how to read, but he said, okay, so you can't tell anyone you know how to read. You have to make mistakes, because as a Jew, don't do that. So you just have to
bring the attention to yourself.
That's right. So he's like, you have to make mistakes. You have to you can't just, and it seems like it's a small conversation, but to your point, it's not. When we're young, what is it? By the age of 7, our self-concept is pretty set, right? And so these messages we hear that if you get too safe, you're unsafe, just what you said. It seems like a paradox, but it's not. And then on top of, the anti-Semitism, and we come as refugees. So at 13, almost 14, I have this other whole thing of, wait, hold on. I'm again an other, and, you talk about belonging. So it resonates a lot. And I think that one of the things that has been very helpful to me, and I wonder your thoughts on this, one of the things I've been allergic to in American psychology, I had to go see a psychologist when we came here because the welfare agency assigned us one. And I remember one of the first questions, I don't think it was a fantastic psychologist. One of the first questions, one of the first kind of areas of inquiry that he started on was kind of it felt to me like, what could I blame my parents for? Because I was very
Ah,
angry, obviously. I mean, I didn't speak English. All the kids were making fun of me. We lived in the project. Look, it was bad. Life was hard. And I've always had this allergy of around this like idea of blaming our parents, but I'm connecting the same to it's not that my parents or my grandparents, like you said, they did everything out of pure love. And I think this is something important for people listening. This isn't about blaming our ancestors. This is about understanding they were doing their best with the tools that they had, including emotional tools. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, because I think this is really important, like how we can, instead of kind of using our past as this deterministic experience, well, this is how it was in my past, so this is how I am, which
mm,
I often hear. And I admit I have an allergy to. It's something that
mm,
when I work
mhm.
with people or in a group, I have like this visceral reaction. But I wonder if you could talk about how we actually look at our past with loving and compassionate lens,
Mm.
and I guess use it as a place of inquiry and understanding versus the rationale for this is just how I am. Can't
Right,
change.
right. So what you're doing is you're walking a line, and you understand that. And I don't know if it's an American thing. I don't know if it's a psychological thing or psychology, the profession, but it certainly is the cartoonish representation of understanding the past. Um, and so, right off the bat, I will say one of the most empowering quotes I ever read by Carl Jung was, "I am not what has happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Now, what's really important about that isn't just the agency implicit in the second half. What's really important is to not disconnect or dismember that which has happened to me. See, I get the feeling that you had, Natalie. I get your allergic reaction. I totally understand it. In fact, if you go down that path, there are many people who worry about being lost in the fog of the past.
Mm.
And if I go there, I'll never get out. Okay? Again, a totally understandable experience. But denial of the past does not make the past go away.
Mm-hmm.
Dismemberment of that which has happened does not make it not so. And in my exploration of these questions, what I have come to understand, and I'll be very candid, I grew up with a lot of anger at my father. It's
Mm.
implicit in Reboot. Why didn't he shield me from my mother who was mentally ill? But in Reunion, when I sought to understand my father in a
Mm.
different way, when I empathetically explored, because he
Mm-hmm.
passed 30 years ago, what must it have been like for a man to have been given up for adoption at 18 months old, only to discover at 21 on his wedding day, because his mother was so angry with him, that the woman he thought of as his mother was in fact not his mother, because she screamed at him, "You're not my son, you were adopted." What must it have been like for a man to be rejected not once, but twice
Mm.
by a mother? Just empathetically stepping into that body
Mm-hmm.
enabled me to not only understand him, but then to turn around and go visit the gravesite of his biological mother in Ireland so that I can complete a reunion,
Mm.
so that I can put the past to rest.
Mm-hmm.
This is the process that we're talking about. It's not we don't look backwards to get stuck. We look backwards to know where we need to be and where we're going. See, they go back to that Carl Jung quote, I am not what has happened to me, I am what I choose to become. The agency of becoming what I choose to become is rooted in remembering that which has happened.
That's poignant. And I think, Jerry, as we're talking, one thought keeps coming to me. It's that when we deny any part of ourselves, the past, the stuff we screwed up, the greatness, right? So one of the things I've recently, so I have a mentor that it was actually a few weeks ago, I had this realization in one of our conversations of something that, these things we know right below the surface, but like we don't say them because if you say it, you really see it. So it's been like over here simmering. And, my husband, Avi, and I, we met at college. So we've been together for 27 years. And it's wonderful to have a mirror like that. When I told him I had this realization, he looked at me like, it's like you're realizing you breathe oxygen. What are you talking about? But the realization I had is that one of my greatest skills is to deny my goodness and my greatness. I always have an excuse for why I've been given an opportunity or why I have so many. But again, it's just the denial of that part of me. So I think that what's emerging in this conversation, which I think is so important, when we deny any part of ourselves, including our past or things we're good at or things that hurt us or any of that causes suffering.
Yeah, Carl Jung, again, to quote him, said, when we deny our shadow, denying your shadow is like trying to get rid of a headache with a beheading. It's when and again, the denial of parts of ourselves, either the negative parts of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that we don't like, or as in your case, the parts of ourselves that are gold. When we deny those things and project them onto other people, we are being complicit in our own diminishment. We are being complicit in our own unhappiness, in our own suffering. So when we remember all of the parts of ourselves and reunite with the parts of ourselves, even the parts of ourselves that are uncomfortable to remember, like, I'm really skilled at this. I'm really good at this. In Reboot, I talk about how important it is for me to be a writer. The experience of internalizing the fact that I'm a good writer took an enormous amount of effort on my part. And even now, when I talk about it, I will say, God gave me the gift. Because I can't say it's just intrinsic to me.
Yes.
Right? But when we take that all in, then something magical happens. We get to access a deep and profound, not only compassion for ourselves, but empathy for the other.
That's right.
Right. And you're the one who started with a gratitude app for a company called Happier, because you made the connection between gratitude and happiness. Well, I will expand upon that and say empathy and compassion for the other is a root cause of happiness.
Yes.
Empathy for the other not only makes us welcome the refugee, as every single wisdom tradition teaches us to do, but it also is key to our own happiness.
That's very powerful. And I think it's very true with a capital T. And I just want to go back for a moment to what you were talking about, how long it took you to internalize that you're a good writer. Because what's been really interesting for me as, I started doing this work and working with all kinds of awesome humans, as I like to call people, is how brilliant our inner critic is and how difficult it is for us to embrace. When I talk to people like about their unique gifts or their abilities, I cannot tell you how many people say, I don't have any unique gifts, Natalie. What are you talking about? And just as a personal, we were talking before the recording, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see my art behind me. And this has been a part of myself that I denied for 40 years. I didn't start painting till I was 40, even though I wanted to do it for a long time. But even after I've started to paint, and my art is, sometimes it's on stage and my slides, and I talk about it sometimes, but the process, to use your words, of internalizing that I am an artist and that maybe I'm a good artist has been a whole new unraveling. I didn't even realize I would have to go through that process, but I'm realizing that. So I wonder if you would talk about, maybe it's the last area we'll explore, because you do a lot of work with leaders and CEOs, founders running companies. And one of the things, as I've reflected back on Happier, let's take the tech company Happier. It's still called Happier, we just do different things. But I can draw a direct line, Jerry, between my lack of self-compassion to us not making it as a business, not as a responsibility. There were many other factors, including, it's a mobile consumer app, very hard business model, like all kinds of things. But I can draw a direct line between, as a leader, lacking self-compassion and kind of flagellating myself with endless self-criticism and self-doubt. I can draw a line to like that. So I wonder if you would talk about, for leaders, for CEOs, for entrepreneurs, the challenges. I'm sure you see this in your work that many have, in just like treating themselves with compassion, and how that actually connected to the radical self-inquiry, how that actually is the essence of great leadership. Because it's not what we talk about learned behavior. That is, I started out my career at McKinsey. Right. And when they talked to us about leadership, it was all, I call it the stock photo of leadership: crossed arms, confidence, project confidence and positivity,
Right,
so.
Right. Let me try to make this simple, because what you're really opening up is a complex thing. So, in the Gnostic Gospels, St. Thomas wrote in Jesus's mouth, or put words in Jesus's mouth. Let me try to remember what he said. If you bring forth what is in you will save you. If you do not bring forth what is in you will destroy you. I don't quote the Bible often, and that's the Gnostic Bible, so we'll see. But if someone who holds power uses the denial and dismemberment process to place into the shadow the parts of themselves, good and bad, that they want to dismember and disown, it will come back and destroy you. And those of us who hold power, we see this in our communities, we see this in our companies. It will come back and destroy the community, and it will come back and destroy the company. When we give political power to someone who is so tortured internally and narcissistic, and they project all of the worst traits that every human has onto those around them and demonize them, the result is dissension, disunion, and a kind of separateness that really destroys us.
Mm-hmm.
But when people who hold power with remorse, not guilt, take back the parts of themselves, positive and negative, we create the space for the entire community to do the same. Whether it's a community of mothers who are coming together, or it's your employees. That's why this work is so important. When you marry radical self-inquiry with people who hold power, you have the possibility of creating a life-giving work environment instead of a soul-sucking work environment.
That's, as you said, we could have a whole really long conversation on this, but I think it's so important. And, you know, my publisher, Sounds True, and their founder, Tammy Simon, you know, we've done a lot of work together, podcasts, workshops, in addition to publishing my books. And what I'm always aware of, and the same goes true for my publisher who's there, Jamie Schwab. And, you know, granted that this is the spiritual work, this is what they're steeped in, but what I'm always deeply touched by, because when I'm working with Sammy, I'm in her community, right? She's in power. She's the founder of this publisher, is exactly what you're talking about. There's never, in my experience, a denial, right? In a conversation, she'll say, oh, Natalie, you're saying this. It's making me realize I haven't looked at this part of myself. But just even those small interactions, every time I'm in that sphere, I feel empowered. And it's not a rah. There is no rah. You know, let's
the
go.
McKinsey leadership rah.
That's right, McKinsey leadership. So I think what you're talking about is so true. And I also just think, Jerry, and I'm sure you've seen this in your work, for me, probably the biggest impact I've seen is in my family, right? Whereas I spent so much of my life tortured, and again, thinking that was a virtue. And to see how much it's healed and how much, I'm going to use this word, how much just like joy, like I don't mean forced joy, just natural joy and wonderfulness it's brought into my family, with my husband and my daughter, my parents, when I have started to do this work. I think to me, that's the closest community. So I think that's, you know, our companies are the extension, but that's our closest community. So it's so important. Jerry, thank you. I could keep you here for hours, but I want to respect your time. But I am, as I have been for, I think it's about a decade of encountering your work. So this is a special treat for me because I get to express my gratitude to you personally, not just for this incredibly compassionate conversation, which is the thread in your work, the quality of your work that I've always loved, insight with compassion versus insight that stings, right? In a way that makes us close up. So thank you for being, and thank you for sharing yourself and your wisdom so compassionately and lovingly, including in this conversation.
Well, what a delight. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and for the invitation to be in conversation about these things. Thank you for doing the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. And everyone listening and watching, thank you for being. Thank you for sharing a little bit of your hearts and minds with me and Jerry. And as I always say, I will be in your ear and see you on our next episode.